Okay, welcome back to another lesson here by the famous. We're going to be looking at just finishing up that autopsy last slide about the Y cut and the block method real fast, and then we're going to get into your second set of PowerPoint slides regarding the function and categorization of bones. And we'll start out real simple, and I'll provide the details of the bones that you should get into your cranium. Okay, so the Y-cut incision, as it's referred for autopsy, is the one you typically will see on any of the shows, and it is an actual method of incision for autopsy, where an incision goes from the corner of the shoulder down to the bottom of the sternum, the breastbone, and continues off to the other shoulder and goes all the way down to the pubic bone. So that literally makes a Y incision across throughout the entire torso. Once that incision is made, the flesh can be peeled right back open, like you would open shutters on on an old farmhouse. That incision goes deep enough to cut through the muscles and sinew and parenchyma connective tissue, and it then allows the medical examiner or coroner, typically medical examiner, to get literally parrot beak clippers, those that you would use to lop off branches off of your azalea bushes in the fall for trimming, or really any wooden stick, as up to as thick as about 2 fingers, and they take the parrot beak clippers and cut all of the cartilaginous ribs that connect to the sternum, that ossify into your rib cage. We do have cartilaginous connectors of our ribs to our sternum, so that allows for expansion of the chest cavity for respiration. If your ribs were completely bony from the dorsal end of the vertebrae coming all the way around to your ventral sternum, it would be a solid bony cage that wouldn't allow for expansion for respiration. So for living purposes, that cartilage is super important. For autopsy purposes, that cartilage is reasonably easy to clip through with parrot beak clippers. There really is not another actual medical tool they use, because this person's not going to be necessarily put back into working order again. So they take those parrot beak clippers, cut that cartilaginous connective tissue away, and then can crack open the entire rib cage and get to the organs within for examination. Hi, Cheech. So that Y-cut incision is, the first step in the important procedure of determining cause of death, and then hopefully manner of death thereafter. Then the next topic under Y incision is the block method, and the block method is secondary to the Y incision. So the block method refers to the removal and examination of all of the organs above the diaphragm, separately from the removal and examination of all of the organs that lie below the diaphragm. And the diaphragm is a very strong muscle that controls your breathing. So when you inhale, the diaphragm pulls down, creating a larger space in your thoracic cavity, allowing for air to rush in. And then the diaphragm pushes upwards to minimize the capacity of your thoracic cage and exhale whatever you breathed in. That's the muscle that actually spasms when you have hiccups, and is a vital organ, vital tissue that carries out significant function. So everything above is in your everything above the diaphragm is in your thoracic cage, and everything below the diaphragm is in what's considered your abdomen. So the block method is simply a separation of the organs above the diaphragm from the organs below the diaphragm. Block method. Now, in one more element of an autopsy, and for specifics of forensic reasoning, the organs are not only examined; they are also each individually weighed, and slices of those organs' tissue are sent off for pathology to see if there's some toxicologic or disease pathway, perhaps, that was integral to the cause of death. And also, some of those tissue samples from each of those organs are frozen and stored in case there has to be further investigation, even years down the road. It's much easier to thaw out frozen tissue than it is to exhume a body and try to investigate tissue that has been decomposing or has been somewhat preserved from the formalin embalming fluid typically used in the United States. So, autopsy is clearly a very important aspect. Now, my medical examiner friend told a great story years back about how the Pitt County medical examiner's office used Sears, the company Sears, hedge trimmers, because they have a lifetime warranty. So when, after years and years of thousands and thousands of autopsies, and they started to get dull or degrade in a way, he could legitimately take that pair of clippers back to Sears and trade them in for a brand new set free of charge, and no one would be the wiser that these hedge clippers have been an integral tool used in the legal dismemberment of human thoracic cages for years. Craziness. All right, so moving on to your next set of slides, called the Anthropology Second Set PowerPoint. I think there's 11 slides there. If you'd zoom up to the title slide, it's Anthropology Second Set, and move forward to the first actual slide, labeled Classification of Bones. And we do have all sorts of different bones in our skeleton. 206, I don't know, I have to double check, it's something like that, as an adult skeleton. And we split them up into several different categories, both by shape or function, as well as position in the body. And we divide the broadest categories into the axial skeleton and the appendicular skeleton. The axial skeleton are those bones that include your skull, craniofacial bones, vertebral column, thoracic cage. That's your axis, as we are bilaterally symmetrical down an axis. The axis is your head and your vertebral column and your rib cage. These are bones, or a collection of bones, that you pretty much cannot live without. Yeah, a broken one or a slightly malformed one here or there, within the axial skeleton is survivable, but for the most part, these are absolutely integral to the survival of the human. They are, the cranium protects your most vital organ, your central processing unit up here, the brain. The spinal column protects the central nervous system spinal cord, which is the highway to the rest of your body from your brain, and from the rest of your body back to your brain. So that's an important organ that needs to be protected. And your rib cage or thoracic cage is super important in protecting the ticker, right, and the lungs, the kidneys in the back. So your super most vital organs are protected in these cases, if you will, of hardened bone. So that's your axial skeleton, and we'll learn most of the bones that make up the axial skeleton. And then you have your appendicular skeleton, much like your appendix. If you have learned by now that your appendix is sort of a vestigial organ, it's something you can live without. The appendix of a book isn't really the main part of the book. It's sort of an afterthought there. Your appendicular skeleton is made up of your limbs, your long bones that make up your arms, and the long bones that make up your legs, and all of the short bones and irregular bones that make up your hands and feet. Those are appendicular, completely separate, and you can live without some of those bones. If you lose your leg, you can still carry out a reasonably normal, perfectly healthy and successful life. Not so much if you lose, parts of your axial skeleton, or at least your level of compromise is going to be quite a bit greater with an axial skeleton injury or dismemberment versus appendicular. Okay, so those are your two major broad categories of skeletal divisions. Okay. Checking my cat's at the door. All right, boop, beep, boop. We're going to move on to the next slide, going down to the classification of bones by shape. And there's a nice schematic of a skeleton there for you. And what has highlighted and pulled out to focus on is the humerus. It's one very good example of a long bone. Long bones are, as their name denotes, longer than they are anything else. The long bones are found in your axial skeleton, and we have bilaterally paired long bones. We have two humerus. One humerus is the upper arm, other humerus is your other upper arm. We have the radius and ulna, your antebrachium, your forearm, another two long bones in the left, and two long bones analogously, your radius and your ulna, in your right antebrachium or forearm. Your legs, pretty much the same thing as your arms, have the same setup of three major long bones. Your femur is your upper leg bone, the bone that spans from your knee up into your hip, and that's one big long femur. It's the longest long bone in the human skeleton. And below the knee is your lower two-leg bone complex. Just like your radius and ulna on your wrist, you have a tibia and fibula as your lower leg long bones. I had noted in a previous lecture that your tibia is your weight-bearing bone. So if you're standing up, all of your upper body weight is distributed through your legs, down your femurs and down your tibias. The fibulas are on the outside of your lower leg. They're much more slender long bones, and they're used for articulating with your ankle and heel for balance and locomotion. So the major long bones I'd like you to be familiar with in the appendicular skeleton are the humerus, radius and ulna, femur, tibia, and fibula. This should be somewhat helpful in the skeleton schematic that I sent you for yesterday's assignment, which again is not due until the following week. So long bones, those are our longest of our long bones. We can click it to the next slide or refer to your next slide. Where we're going to classify bones by shape. Short bones, why not? Start with the long, then we go to the short. Maybe some extra credit, some of the bones that I have had broken for me. One of the long bones that I have had done is my right femur. I have a metal pin that goes down half the length of my right femur, and another pin that goes through the trochanter, femoral neck, and femoral head, all of which we'll learn more details about skeletally, but that's one of my awesome injury bones. All right, so short bones. Short bones are found in the hands, feet, and wrist. They are far less obvious in shape by looking at a regular person with your regular eyes. We see them most clearly in X-ray images, because they're sort of a complex collection of articulating bones that gives us flexibility, balance, grip, and locomotion in the fine motor skill area. Short bones are cubic in many cases, and we find probably the ones you encounter most often in terms of just looking, your wrist bones, your carpals. If you have heard of carpal tunnel syndrome, that deals with the sheath that goes around the tendons that connect your hand to your wrist and allows for flexion of the hand and grabbing, and most people do typing, and all of this repetitive motion can add up to some eventual inflammation of the carpal tendons, giving rise to carpal tunnel syndrome. But the carpals themselves, where the name originates from carpal tunnel syndrome, are the short bones, these little cubey-doobs like dice, sugar cubes size bones that make up your flexible wrist and ankle. We also have another odd one, the patella. The patella is the fancy medical term for your kneecap. And the kneecap bone is an interesting one that starts out completely cartilaginous when you're born. Infants have, you ever look at an infant's knee or a little baby knee? There's like little Pillsbury Doughboy people, just mushy. They don't even have kneecaps. Kevin's here. They have cartilaginous patellas that ossify over the first 2 years of development. And this bone, this patella, it forms within a tendon, and it is the sort of the connective point between your femur and your tib-fib complex down low. It's your knee, a major joint, super necessary for locomotion, and that patella rests within the between the tendons within the patellar ligament. Fun fact about patellas in animals, they have them too. All mammals have kneecaps. Your little dog, if you have one, or cats have patellas. And if you've ever seen a little dog running around and all of a sudden it lifts up its back leg like it's in pain and it hobbles on three feet instead of 4, you think you stepped on something or caused a problem. No, their patella actually slides out of the groove that it should rest in. And small dogs will luxate or lose their patella medially. It'll pop inwards. And a lot of times people worry when they first see it. And you can literally just flex the dog's leg and push with your thumb, clip, and this little tiny patella pops back into place. The dog's totally fine. Through selective breeding, human-made breeds like this fine example of a hi Kevin of a human-made breed. Ain't nothing right about this dog. When we breed for traits like long luxurious hair and no shedding and cute faces and all of this stuff, some of the other actual functioning aspects of the body itself are oftentimes overlooked. And in most small breed dogs, and especially toy breed dogs, Chihuahua, got one of those down there, their kneecaps pop inwards. And that's because the groove in which the patellar ligament is supposed to ride is not deep enough to hold it in place. So they oftentimes have these common little idiosyncrasies. So they pop out inwards. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, big dogs, your Great Danes, your Rottweilers, Dobermans, Shepherds, and big dogs, they have an anomaly in their patellar groove on the lateral side. They will pop out outwards. The little dogs will pop out inwards medially, and the big dogs' patellas will pop out laterally. Now, the big dogs are a little more complicated to get back into place because they're a much bigger dog. It takes more force to get it back in place. And if it causes some minor discomfort in doing so for the dog, you're looking at, maybe have someone who is familiar with how to do it show you how. Side notes, but valuable. Because I'd hate to make a Rottweiler angry when I'm just trying to help. But a dog like Kevin, what's he gonna do? All right, so the patella, the kneecap. Kneecap is one of the hardest bones in the body once it is hardened, ossified. Very, very hard to break a kneecap, as they say. I'm gonna break your kneecaps in the mob. So that's a tough one. There's no sexual dimorphism. It has almost no forensic value in terms of literally anything, but it is a major important bone in your body, so it's good to know the patella is the kneecap. All right. So, flat bones. We're going to click it to the next slide, and I see that I'm at a 22.5-minute spot, so I've only got a couple more minutes to go. Flat bones. These are super important bones. They are, as their name denotes, flatter than they are long or short. They're flat. And these bones make up your breastbone, called the sternum. It has two processes on it, xiphoid process complex. Another one of my least favorite bones. Just super gross. You can feel it in the middle of your chest. You can feel your breastbones. You go down, and then there's that sort of little indentation. In that indentation lies this little triangular tip that is on a cartilaginous hinge. And this is the bone that we are concerned about if you're ever performing CPR or the Heimlich removal method for someone choking, that if you break that little pointy xiphoid process inward, you can damage the person's diaphragm, and it's kind of dangerous, and it's just so uncomfortable feeling to me. It's one of those gross ones for me. Now, we all have a sternum, and if we were birds, our flat bone sternum would be called our keel, because it is flattened side in. It's more like a knife blade facing you as opposed to looking at it this way. This is where all of the flight muscles, the pectoral muscles of the bird, are attached. It's where our pectoral muscles are attached for some of our ambulatory motion of our arms. And for birds, that ambulatory motion of their analogs to arms, their wings, is all of that breast muscle connected to the the keel, which is your sternum. The sternum does protect your internal organs of your thoracic cage, because remember earlier I mentioned you had cartilaginous tissue on either side of the sternum that allows for expansion of your thoracic cage, but that connects to hardened, ossified, real calcium bone as your sternum, and that protects the bulk of your heart and medial sides of your lungs. Super important bony complex there. The sternum is not the only flat bone that's super duper important. We have got... Stop, Cheech! Cheecho! Dog's nuts. Okay, so we have other flat bones. Our frontal bone, our parietal bones, our temporal bones, and as I alluded to last week, the occipital bone in the back. So our cranial bones are considered flat bones as well. Super important. And I believe we've talked a little bit, or I've told you a little bit about the importance forensic-wise of cranial bones in terms of the determination of age due to the fusion of those fontanelles from infancy, and the fusion, the lines left, the fissures, as they're called, left as your connective sections of your parietal bones to your frontal bone and your occipital bone. All of them have what's called fissures, and they look like satellite imagery of rivers meandering across the surface of the planet. Kind of cool, and they give you a very good, at least, age bracket of how old the person was at the date of their termination, by any means. And the flat bones also, the cranial flat bones, also are an excellent recorder of history of an actual or possible cause of death. When we look at a specific compression fracture or a depression fracture in that flat bone, not a compression, depression fracture, or puncture wound, bullet hole, entry or exit wound, blunt force trauma or sharp force trauma wounds. Lots of times when you're finding a situation of homicide, there's going to be damage to the cranial flat bones. And cranial flat bones, don't hold up well to a hammer or a bullet or an axe or a pipe or a baseball bat or any of the other tools of the trade that unfortunately are oftentimes used for nefarious purposes, violence and death. And I'll talk a little bit in our next session, perhaps, about how it records these blows or massive trauma. So flat bones, really important in the forensic field, much more important than those those short bones are. Flat bones, excellent recorder of possible cause of death. And the long bones, as our first section, looking at height determination from our last lecture. All right, 28 minutes, all that I'm allowed to do. I'd love to go on, but unfortunately for you, I cannot. All right, we'll pick up here where we left off on our next session. Talk soon.